Hello, and welcome to Beering in Mind Beer Reviews. We have been focusing primarily on Japanese beers, both craft beer and beer from Japanese majors, and today we're going to go a little far afield to Belgium, and we're going to look at a type of beer which is not terribly popular here in Japan. Actually not terribly popular anywhere except among true beer geeks, and that is the lambic, or in this case the gueuze style. And we're going to look at a beer which is called Oude Geuze Boon, and this is a beer which is made from a lambic beer. And let's take it slowly here. Lambic is a style of beer which is produced in a very small part of Belgium, on the outskirts of Brussels, primarily around the village of Lambic, and hence we get the name Lambic from it here. And what they do is make a wort and boil up a wort and put it up in the attic of their brew house and open the windows for a single night. And whatever yeast happens to land on top of the wort is the yeast that will begin the fermentation. So just one night. And these of course are wild yeasts that are just floating through the air and have a certain concentration in this area of certain types of yeast that will produce an interesting flavor in this beer. So just one night, and then close the windows and put them into casks, wooden casks. Now, the wooden casks also have yeasts in them, resident yeasts, and they're used repeatedly. And some of the yeasts are what are called Brett yeasts, Brettanomyces yeast, and these are kind of a semi-wild yeast, and they tend to produce all sorts of interesting flavors in the barley malt, the wort. So they spend time in the casks, and then they are put into bottles, and they are fermented in the bottles as well. So not filtered. I don't know if you can see clearly here, but there is some gunk on the bottom, some sediment from the yeast that has settled out here. Now, what Boon does is they do this only during the cold months in that part of the world, which is from October through April. And they do this to limit the sourness, during warm months the yeast could probably run wild and maybe just produce some completely uncontrolled flavors. So they produce it during the cold months, and they also, the hops that are used in lambic beers are traditionally old hops, old dry hops, and they're just not designed to give a lot of aroma or flavor to the beer. Boon, their gueuze. Now, gueuze is what is called, or what is a blend of lambics, a blend of vintages of lambics. And so what Boon does typically is use 90% of a 2-year-old lambic, a 2-year-old lambic that's been sitting in the cask for 2 years, and then 5% of a 1-year-old, and 5% of a 3-year-old lambic, and blend them together. And there's probably some, I wouldn't say probably exactly 5%, they may hedge here. So the skill is not only in producing a lambic, but then in blending those lambics. It's kind of an art to do that. The lambic style almost went out of existence in the 1970s. During that time, sweeter beers or people weren't drinking lambics as much, and so a lot of brewers turned towards sweetened lambics, and you can still find a lot of these on the market, a lot of fruity, sweet lambics. And also because of a European Union restriction during the early days of the European Union, were putting in restrictions on many things, of course, rules and regulations, and one of the things they did not like was the use of these old casks for sanitary reasons. The old casks, which include the crucial Brett yeast for producing a lambic. And I don't recall exactly what happened, but somehow they did get around it, and they got an exception for that here. And Boon, Frank Boon, the head brewer and blender, really helped with the revival of lambic in his area here. And in fact, he makes a wort that is so high in quality that a lot of other lambic makers in the area use it in their blends as well. Okay, so briefly, that's a brief introduction to what lambic and gueuze is. Again, lambic is this beer that's been fermented, inoculated with wild yeast, and then stored in casks for 1 to 2 to 3 to more years. And lambics are a blend of different vintages of gueuze. Now, we're going to open this up. This is 2011, 2012 vintage, so it was produced during that October 2011 to April 2012 time frame, which means it's 7 years old, or 7 years in the bottle. And because of this, I am going to go away and open this over the sink. Sometimes these beers tend to foam over, or as we say, they are gushers. And I don't want that to happen here on the table, so I'll be right back after I open this up. Hello, I'm back, and this beer did not gush. In fact, it didn't even make a pop. Wondering about that. Okay, so on Rate Beer, Geuze Boon has a 1,582 ratings for an average score of 3.62 and a 93 percentile for all beers on Rate Beer, and just a 34 percentile for lambic gueuze style, and not so high there since gueuze has shot up in popularity over the last 10, 15 years or so. A lot of them have much higher ratings. This is 6.5%, and actually on here it says 7%. The Japanese label says 7%, so I assume it's one of the two, 6.5 or 7. Let's give this a go. Now in Belgium, these bottles will be held in baskets that are kind of this shape to hold the bottle in this way, so the yeast does not interfere too much. So when you drink a lambic, generally the first pours will taste quite different from the final pours that have the sediment in it. And let's see what we got here. So you can see the color, it's kind of a hazy orange gold color. Not a lot of head, a little bit of slippery lace, not much going on. Aroma? This is quite floral, extremely floral, vegetal, something like rhubarb, which is typical for a lambic or gueuze, something like rhubarb tart, sort of vegetable sort of thing. It's quite earthy with a barnyard sort of note into it. Apples, definitely apples, citrus, and the yeast is definitely present here. It has some pickles, perhaps. And now, the flavor. Sort of a light ginger tinged vegetal note, sour, grapefruit, apples, some oak, some wood, pickled fruit, quite dry in the finish. And there's something like fresh cream, like a fresh cream residue on the tongue. Not heavy, but very light. Something creamy and light on the end there. Quite effervescent, very light-bodied. This is not too sour. It's a little bit sharp, fairly complex. So I would consider this kind of a starter gueuze for if you haven't had a gueuze before or a lambic. You might start with something like this, like a Boon Geuze here. It doesn't have really strong, sharp, rude characteristics that some gueuzes can have. And I would say from this you can move on to something a little bit more complex, more interesting, such as Boon's mariage parfait, perhaps, something like that. Dry Fontaine, you'll see the bottle with a 3F on it. Cantillon, of course, if you can find it. Cantillon is a little bit hard to find these days. Girardin, Oude Geuze, or Tilkin, and all of those tend to be a little more complex than the Boon one. So as I say, a kind of starter gueuze. You give this a try and see what you think, and then move on from there. So in Japan, these are not terribly expensive. I got this, I think, for around 600 yen, which was at that time probably $5 or $6, in that range, 5 or 6 US. So not terribly expensive. So wherever you are, if you have never had lambic or gueuze, go out and expand your horizons a bit and take a look at what wild beer can be like. Okay. All right, well, that's it this time. Next time I'm going to take a look at another beer from Boon. That will be Bone Creek Cherry Lambic or Cherry Gueuze. All right, thank you very much for watching. Bye-bye.